All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this week's edition of Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. I'm Dr. Robert Greene II, the lead instructor of the Modjeska Simkins School. And this evening, we're going to get into some fairly recent history, both in South Carolina and across the country. And actually, tonight, I'm glad we're doing New Left and Southern Strategy this evening, because a lot of things going on in the world right now relate directly to what we're talking about this evening. Over the weekend, several major nations held elections. Mexico voted into office its first female president. South Africa also held an election where, for the first time since 1994, the African National Congress will not have a majority in its legislature. So we've got a lot of things going on all over the world. And in case you've not already heard, there is a presidential election in this country coming up in November, which everyone's pretty calm about. So we have a lot of things to discuss. And if you're wondering why I am wearing a Homestead Grace jersey and hat, it is because, of course, last week it was announced by the Baseball Hall of Fame that they are now going to consider statistics from the Negro Leagues on par with those of Major League Baseball, saying that the Negro Leagues are now a major league level entity. That's a long way of saying things that many Black baseball fans knew for generations, which was that folks like Josh Gibson or Cool Papa Bell or Larry Doby were just as good as Babe Ruth or Lou Gehrig or Ty Cobb. So again, we're seeing a lot of things going on with history and memory in society right now. And a lot of this actually relates to what we're going to discuss this evening, which is the history of the last 50 to 60 years, or for some of the folks in our class, their lifetimes, for all intents and purposes. So I want to get started, and actually going to be a tag team tonight. Of course, I'll be talking about some of this history. And of course, Brett will also bring things closer to home, talking about the history of the Grassroots Organizing Workshop, or GROW, an organization that did a lot of work here in South Carolina and now does a lot of that work through the South Carolina Progressive Network. So I actually wanted to start tonight's conversation with this image. And this is an image that I think kind of sums up some of the lessons of tonight's class. This actually shows James Felder on the left with Jesse Jackson from 1973. Part of why I'm using this image is that last year, Mr. Felder was a guest speaker in our school, and he was tickled when he saw this image as well. But this shows how South Carolina in the 1960s and 70s and 80s was the center point, not just of social movements in the South, but of social movements across the United States and around the world. If you've learned nothing else from this class this semester, I hope you've taken the lesson of how South Carolina is never on its own in terms of organizing and activism to heart. We often say that you can't change DC without changing SC. That has certainly been the case, historically speaking, as well. A lot of the movements we're talking about today on both the left and the right had their origins in South Carolina or had important battles in South Carolina. So, of course, this is an image of political power in the South that Black Americans only dreamed of even a generation before this. By the 1970s, things like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were finally being enforced. But I want to go back a little bit just for a second, because one of the key themes of the class, of course, has been the importance of South Carolina to national and international politics. And this brings us to the idea of the Southern strategy. I think if any of you have heard about the Southern strategy over the years, if you've heard that term thrown around either in history classes or political science classes, then you know that the Southern strategy is one of those things that permanently altered American politics and American history. But while we often locate Southern strategy in the 1960s and 70s, as the Republican Party began to win more white Southern voters, it's important to note that the GOP had been trying to get and break the white South for generations. So you think about, for example, folks like Ben Tillman, who represent how the Democratic Party of the South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was very much devoted to white supremacy and just staying within that Democratic Party coalition. You fast forward a couple of generations, James Burns, the man you see on the right, is also firmly implanted within the Democratic Party. But by 1948, there are some serious questions being raised about how much the white South should be loyal to the Democratic Party. This is, of course, as a refresher, because Harry Truman is starting to speak out more forcefully in favor of civil rights. It's part of his 1948 platform. And white Southerners are not really sure what to make of this, right? They've been part of the New Deal coalition for over a decade, but that coalition also includes Black Americans in the North and the Midwest. I often joke with my students, you think about the New Deal coalition, it's a bit unwieldy. Black people and white Southerners in the same political party, that's not going to last forever. And we're already seeing cracks in 1948 with some of these states in the Deep South, the ones in the weird kind of orange color, decide to go for Strom Thurmond. But most of the South stays with Harry Truman. They don't trust Republicans for civil rights. They know Truman. They kind of trust Truman, but that's not going to last very long either. One thing I want to point out too, though, is that when we talk about the Southern strategy, we tend to talk about Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, and of course, Harry Dent, we'll talk about in a second. But even before Harry Dent makes a, pardon the pun, dent on national politics, I'm sorry, I had to do this. This is why my students at Claflin think I have a very peculiar sense of humor, but I digress. You have folks like Dwight D. Eisenhower already trying to get white Southern voters on the side of the Republican Party. This is actually a photograph from Eisenhower's 1952 campaign for president, where he took a swing through the Deep South. He came to Columbia, South Carolina, and here he is shaking hands with our good and honorable friend, James Burns. Now, remember, Eisenhower was a Republican. Burns was a Democrat. And yet what we're seeing here is that Southern Democrats are already starting to make some flirtations with the GOP. Not a whole lot, because again, the Republican Party in the 50s was divided between liberal and conservative wings. But Dwight D. Eisenhower thinks his popularity from World War II was able to attract a sizable number of white Southern voters, especially in states like Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, the Upper South, places like that. And he's also making inroads into suburbs, major cities across the South too. Not really making direct appeals to racism so much as making appeals to things like states' rights, making appeals to small government, and so forth. The irony of this, of course, is that within a few years, because of Brown v. Board, President Eisenhower is going to have to actually enforce that law by sending the 101st Airborne to Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas, losing a lot of support amongst the white South in the process. But again, you see these flirtations happening in the 1950s and early 60s. Again, this is Eisenhower in Columbia, South Carolina, once again on a tour through the South. One thing about Eisenhower that's also worth noting is that he had a deep reverence for Robert E. Lee. He would give speeches about how much he honored Robert E. Lee and other Southern generals during the Civil War, and how he felt a deep kinship with the white South, despite the fact that Eisenhower himself was from Kansas, but he often identified and sympathized with white Southerners. Still, amongst a lot of white conservatives in the South, by the 1960s, there were some serious questions about, well, which party they actually belong to. In 1960, John F. Kennedy wins the election essentially because the Black vote swings to him the week before the election. Republicans are arguing amongst themselves about whether or not this means they should be more aggressive and be more pro-civil rights or not, or if they should try to shift their attention towards getting the white South. Now, Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, made the argument throughout the 1960s that, well, we ought to go hunting where the ducks are, end quote. i.e. that he felt the Republican Party's natural conservative base included the Deep South. So he argued, why are we conceding these votes every 4 years? We should try to go after them by having a strong platform of small government, of limited government, and also taking a decisive stance against civil rights. Now, one of the grand ironies of this is that Goldwater in Arizona, where he was a senator, actually had a strong pro-civil rights record. He was actually at one point a member of the NAACP in Arizona. He also supported anti-discrimination laws in Arizona. But in 1964, running for president, he voted against the Civil Rights Act. His argument was he felt it gave too much power to the federal government. He argued it was not a good bill for small government conservatives and libertarians like himself. And after 1964, Goldwater admitted it was the worst mistake of his career to vote against the Civil Rights Act. Now, for his troubles in 64, the Republican Party only won 6 states. Goldwater's home state of Arizona and 5 southern states, including, of course, South Carolina. Keep in mind that same year, Strom Thurmond switched parties from the Democratic to Republican parties as a show of support for the GOP's anti-civil rights stance and pro-Barry Goldwater stance. So when folks saw this map in November of 64, you see all of these editorials and op-ed pieces from around the country saying, well, that's it. Conservatism is dead. This proves that the GOP's flirtation with the far right, with the right wing in this country, was a fool's errand. There's no way in the world conservatism will recover from this in a generation from now. And conservatism is dead. Everybody's a liberal, right? Almost the good old days for like 5 seconds. But there were those in the conservative movement who were still determined to make the Republican Party a firmly conservative party. Again, one of the things that's important to note about American politics is that throughout the 20th century, both major parties had conservative and liberal wings. For the Democratic Party, its conservative wing was often the southern half of the party. For Republicans, they had many conservatives and right-wing Republicans from the Midwest and the West. But folks like Harry Dent, who was from South Carolina, gave a lot of thought to how they could take the Southern brand of conservatism, again, devoted to small government, devoted to anti-civil rights rhetoric, and also deeply, deeply anti-communist, take that brand of Southern conservatism and help it go national, and help to form a national coalition of conservatives. Because again, there were folks in both parties who were asking themselves in the 60s, maybe we should have one liberal party and one conservative party. And there were those by 1968 who felt the conservative party should be the Republican Party. Harry Dent was instrumental in getting that process started and seeing its culmination in 1968 with Richard Nixon, and later in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. Now, again, like I said before, 1964, folks were saying across the country, conservatism is destroyed. There's no way it can recover from this. Yet 16 years later, conservatism seems to be triumphant. Ronald Reagan is head of this Reagan Revolution, a conservative coalition that, of course, as you can see from the map, includes large parts of the South as well. Now, last night, we were fortunate to hear from Bill Fletcher Jr., who gave an incredible talk about the problems we face on the left in terms of movement organizing and building. If you are watching this as a recording right now, I would actually encourage you to stop this recording, go back to the Bill Fletcher recording. You've not already watched it, watch that, and then come back to this one. Because I'm very serious when I say that he laid out a lot of these same themes in a way that's digestible and easy to understand. But to make a long story short, a lot of what Bill Fletcher was talking about you see culminate in 1980, how as the left was trying to build a wide range of social justice movements, the right had firmly coalesced within the Republican Party and had built itself up to win an election like it did in 1980. Again, a big part of this was Harry Dent and his coalition building in the 60s, and also the movement of conservatives from the Democratic to the Republican parties. And that's the standard story we always get about how the country becomes more conservative in the 70s and 80s. But that story leaves out the fact that things didn't quite have to turn out that way. And that, in fact, despite seeing a deep red map like this, there were a lot of folks across the country who were still fighting a variety of movements for human and civil rights throughout the 70s, 80s, and the 1990s. Now, this shift in politics across the country includes a massive shift in the South. And one could make an argument that the South has only really been politically competitive in two periods in history. One is Reconstruction, and the other one is just after 1965, when you start seeing Republicans and Democrats across the South competing for white and Black voters alike. One of my favorite teaching tools in the classroom is an issue of Ebony magazine from 1971 titled The South Today. And actually, pull it up real quick. Give me 1 second. And in that issue, one of the things that the Ebony writers are talking about is how much the American South has changed in the 6 years since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And one of the sections in that magazine, I just have to show this to you guys because this is one of my favorite things to look at in terms of history, is how so many Southern politicians found themselves in a really awkward position, where a lot of them in the 50s and 60s had spoken out against civil rights, and then suddenly they find themselves having to say, well, I didn't really mean all those bad things that I said. I actually like Black people. Some of my best friends are Negroes. To that point, let me show you what I'm talking about here. This is from Ebony. This is from the August 1971 issue. You can find this on Google Books as well. Type in books.google.com, and they have most of the background of Ebony going back to the 50s. And so you have all these politicians, like white politicians from the South, saying how much they like voting rights, how much they like Black people, how much they support civil rights, and how much they want to help the South to move on from the civil rights era. Some of them, I think, were actually being honest and forthright. But I want to go to two folks in particular. Okay, first, George Wallace. Now, in case you don't know, George Wallace in the 60s said, segregation now, segregation forever, so on and so forth. By 1971, when he returns to the governor's office in Alabama, he told Ebony magazine the following. Let me zoom in a bit closer on this. I have always felt that the people in the South could be cited as an example to the rest of the country, because there is a lot of genuine good feeling between Blacks and whites down here. There always has been. Even though we have sometimes been misinterpreted and misunderstood by many who do not really know us, we know that Black people have always had something in the South that they did not have in other sections of the country: concern from whites.
Disappearing.
No, this is what he actually said to Ebony magazine. Concern from whites. Concern's doing a lot of work in that sentence. But that's George Wallace. And then I want to go to one more person, our good old friend, Strom Thurmond, who was in his, I think, 900th year of being from the Senate in South Carolina at this point. But again, like Wallace, and like a lot of other white politicians in the South, Thurmond had to recognize that the Black vote was a powerful block of voters now, and he had to try to find ways to not antagonize Black voters in South Carolina. So he starts off his interview with Ebony Magazine by saying, recently, a friend and supporter of mine in South Carolina related the following story to me. A Black person, when asked to support me for re-election in the United States Senate, replied, quote, "Let me think about it. Senator Thurmond has never stabbed us in the back. He might stab us in the front, but never in the back."
Oh, okay, that's the difference.
My reaction to the story was one of mixed emotions. I was naturally pleased that someone thought me innocent of the charge of being two-faced, a charge often made against those holding political office. Yet it was quite disturbing to realize that perhaps this man spoke for other Black citizens in South Carolina, and that many of my constituents might view me as strongly opposed to their interests. The truth is that I believe in promoting the best interests of all our citizens, both Black and white, and in most instances, I am confident that we have more in common as Southerners than we have reason to oppose each other because of race. So this is in 1971, right? This is not even a decade since the Civil and Voting Rights Act were passed by Congress signed by President Lyndon Johnson. And so what you're seeing is that essentially politicians across the South are having to acknowledge this new normal, at least for the time being. And this includes also Democrats as well, folks like Governor Jimmy Carter of Georgia. Now, when Carter ran for governor in 1970, he was accused by many of running one of the last openly racist campaigns in the history of the South. He ran basically on a platform that, while not being directly opposed to civil rights, was really not civil rights friendly. And what's funny about this, by the way, is many Black politicians in Georgia told folks across the country, "Oh, don't worry about Jimmy Carter. He's actually on our side. He just has to get white voters to support him first." Carter wins the election and then appoints a record number of Blacks to his cabinet, to the government in Georgia, and pretty soon becomes known as the leader of a vanguard of what are known as New South Democrats. Democrats who are mostly white Southerners who support the party, support civil rights, but are also staunchly pro-business. Now, this is an important thing to keep in mind. Folks like Jimmy Carter of Georgia or John C. West of South Carolina were outspoken in their support of civil rights and of Black involvement in the Democratic Party and in state governance, but they were also talking about how pro-business they were, right? And as these New South Democrats gained more power within the National Democratic Party, you began to see that New Deal coalition really crumbling because New South Democrats are talking in a very pro-business, what we would now refer to as a neoliberal outlook on the relationship between government and business, where the government is making itself more staunchly pro-business, arguably at the expense of workers and the working class. And even with this Southern strategy idea starting to take hold in the Republican Party, not everyone is able to win using this strategy of being forcefully for law and order, being outspoken against civil rights and so forth. Albert Watson, who runs for governor of South Carolina in 1970 as Republican nominee, tries to use the Southern strategy in South Carolina. And surprisingly, to many, it doesn't work. The Democrats that year run John C. West for governor, who's able to take a middle-of-the-road stance on a wide variety of issues. Albert Watson is seen as a bit too right-wing, although he gets a lot of votes in South Carolina because it is South Carolina.
That caught being two places at once. That is only.
Not the brightest bulb.
Let me just say about also John C. West. I remember that election, even though it was like 4 or 5. John C. West had a persona that was nice and friendly, probably gentlemanly man. Like I said, just 5 years I remember. And the reason I do is because my grandmother overheard to buy a car at Central Chevrolet, and the salesman looked just like John C. West. And I was only 5, so.
Well, there you go, right? Like, again, these things matter in local and state politics, right? The impressions you make on people, the kinds of things you can get across, kind of messaging you can have. At the same time, one of the reasons why John C. West is becoming pro, let's get Black folks in the Democratic Party, is because of the rise of the United Citizens Party in South Carolina. Now, this was an attempt to create a Black political party in the state during the civil rights and Black power era, late 60s and early 1970s. And while the United Citizens Party, how can I put this? They were never a threat to, say, take over the state government, but they were a threat to Democrats who were concerned about keeping together a governing coalition in the Palmetto State that by 1970 they knew had to include Black voters. Now, some of the supporters of the UCP later migrate into the Democratic Party, including most notably James Clyburn, who, let's see if I have a picture. Yeah.
So I have a question, please.
Go ahead.
Okay, so you're saying that Jim, after the Civil War, and we were supposed to go through Reconstruction, and then the New Deal, we had 68 Black senators, and then after that, what they got rid of all of them, and we didn't have anybody until 1971.
Well, basically from the end of Reconstruction until 1971, yes, there were no Black elected officials in South Carolina during that time period. Or really more accurate, from the 1890s until 1971. And that was the case in a lot of southern states at that time, that in the post-Reconstruction period, Black local power had been virtually destroyed. And it didn't really recover until the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
And then I want to add this because, as I understand it, Strom Thurmond had a Black daughter. Okay, while he up there, he wanted to kill her.
Okay, but by the way, Chris, are we having any issues with Zoom?
Yeah, for whatever reason, it keeps jumping out from the meeting. We're back now, the mic's
Okay.
on.
Do they have audio?
They have audio.
Okay, excellent. Okay. Apologies for that, folks on Zoom. It's just one of those joys of working with technology in the present day. But again, one of the things you're seeing is that, particularly the New Deal, is that by the 60s and 70s, while you're having the growth of Black political power in the South, thanks to the Voting Rights Act, thanks to the Civil Rights Act, the Democratic Party's governing coalition is starting to crumble. And the Republican Party is taking advantage of that by getting more white voters from the South on their side. But this does not happen overnight. That's important to note too. Again, if you're wondering about the first three Black politicians in the state government in South Carolina in 1971, here they are. I.S. Levy Johnson, James Stelder, and Herbert Field. Again, this is the first Black presence in the state government since the end of Reconstruction. And you're seeing stories like this happen all across the South. That's the Democratic Party is starting to bring more and more Black voters into the fold. You're starting to see Black political power once again assert itself throughout the American South. But again, I mentioned how the New Deal coalition is starting to collapse. A big part of this is that in the 1970s, you're also seeing the growth of the religious right, or the evangelical movement, where you're seeing more and more evangelical Christians who are making an argument that they should be more forcefully involved in local, state, and national politics. And by the 70s, it's becoming quite clear that leaders like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and others are really looking at the Republican Party as their home base for political support in the 70s and 80s. Now, in 1976, many of them backed Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, because of Carter's own born-again Christian beliefs. But Carter has an outlook on politics and religion that is a bit more early to mid 20th century, where he had his own personal beliefs religion-wise, but felt that they shouldn't interfere with his politics too much. For many evangelicals, especially in the South, that wasn't enough, and they turned their attention to Ronald Reagan, who in 1980 famously says, "I know you can't support me, at least outwardly, but I certainly support you." Really wins support of many white evangelical Christians across the country. But Reagan and the contemporary GOP also have another reason to owe support to folks from South Carolina. Lee Atwater is part of this political thinking tree of folks from the Palmetto State who played a significant role in the growth of modern conservatism. I just mentioned Harry Dent a moment ago with Richard Nixon. Atwater had that same sort of importance to folks like Reagan and especially George H.W. Bush. Now, in your readings on our website, there's a clip of Atwater talking about how to use race to really galvanize and gin up the conservative vote in America. I want to go ahead and play that clip for class, though. It's a very short clip, but it's and what's important to note here is that he's not using outwardly racist language, but he's using code words and dog whistles to get across what he wants his audience to know, which is that if you were a white Southerner, Republican Party was for you. So let me go ahead and pull up that clip really quickly. Okay. Now, again, this is a clip from 1981. This is the first year of Reagan's administration. And this is, again, Atwater on tape admitting to what he's doing with this strategy.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger, that hurts you, backfire, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.
Okay, so again, that was Lee Atwater in 1981. Now, one thing I will point out, by the way, with that clip is, yes, we have Atwater saying that in the chat. Irene Raxter Rigby has mentioned there's a documentary on Tubi called Boogeyman, the Lee Atwater story, which is a great documentary. I highly recommend watching it. What's interesting about that clip, though, is that 10 years before that, H.R. Haldeman, who was one of Richard Nixon's advisors in the White House, said essentially the same thing, that the Nixon administration had pursued the war on drugs and law and order rhetoric in part to target two groups of people, the left and Black Americans, who they viewed as the two biggest threats to the Nixon White House. Haldeman admits this in an interview that, yeah, the war on drugs thing wasn't really about fighting drugs. It was about locking up Black people, right? And hurting the Black Power movement, hurting the Civil Rights movement, and so forth. So again, all of these things that we're talking about in this class are linked together. And as Bill Fletcher pointed out yesterday, and as I think is important to note again right now, all of these things are heavily linked together even today. So I want to go ahead and wrap up and turn over to Brett, but I want to cover a couple of other things really, really quickly. One is this rather interesting image. If you have had the misfortune of learning anything about the Donald Trump administration, then you're probably familiar with Paul Manafort and Roger Stone, two figures who have been important in recent years to that administration. You see here Lee Atwater also with them. So the Republican Party and its conservative base has a long history of all these kingmakers knowing each other, right? Karl Rove and the Bush administration knew many of these folks. You see this now with the Trump administration, and if Trump returns to the White House, we'll probably see more of this as well. But what this also shows is how, again, South Carolina is playing an important role in national politics in a way that's not always easily seen. You go from a Harry Dent to a Lee Atwater, and you're seeing how both of these men in their work in this larger conservative coalition are helping to build the Republican Party as we know it today, for better or for worse.
Oh.
But again, I mentioned before how things did not have to turn out the way they did. Let's rewind the clock to say 1977 or so. That particular year, there is an International Women's Year Conference in Houston, Texas. The feminist movement is at its highest point. Country that by the end of that decade, if not sooner, there will be a new amendment added to the Constitution, the Equal Rights Amendment, which will simply say that there will be no discrimination on the basis of sex. Even folks like Richard Nixon, Strom Thurmond, Gerald Ford, all come out in favor of the ERA. It is seen as a thing that is going to happen sooner or later, more than likely sooner. But by 1977, 78, the new right in American politics has rallied against the 70s and 80s. Now, before she joined the anti-ERA fight, Schlafly was best known as an ardent Cold Warrior. She wrote extensively about U.S. foreign policy, opposing the expansion of communism around the world. By the 70s, she shifted her focus talking about the ERA and her steadfast opposition to it. In South Carolina, the state legislature starts debating the ERA in the early 1970s. The state house actually passes an ERA bill, but it gets stalled in the state senate. Folks assume it's not that big of a deal. Even if we don't ratify it here in the Palmetto State, surely we'll get it ratified in the other states and it'll be done. Now keep in mind, civics lesson for a second. To get an amendment added to the Constitution, how many states have to ratify it in their state legislatures?
2/3, 38.
Yes, 2/3. In this case, 38 out of 50 states. In the 1970s, number we're at about, I think, 32 or 33 states. And the assumption was we'll get a few more states and be done. The problem was that they got to 35 and that was it. The anti-ERA movement began to make serious inroads in the late 1970s. Another mistake the pro-ERA forces made was that they said, if you give us a deadline, if we can get this, we'll get this passed by initially 1979. Then by 1982, they said, we'll get this added to the Constitution. If we don't, we'll just drop it. That's how confident they were. They would get those last handful of states. 1982 comes and goes, and they're still stuck at 35 states. Now, if you know your Constitution, remember that an amendment can be proposed at any time, and it doesn't die, it doesn't go away, it can still be ratified. For example, the 27th Amendment of the Constitution, the last one we added in 1992, which limits, basically that amendment says, if you're in Congress and you pass a pay raise, it doesn't go into effect until the next Congress comes after you. That amendment was first proposed in the 1790s, and it wasn't ratified until 1992. And it was actually found by a college student in like the 70s who wrote a paper about it, and then people in Congress heard about it, and next thing you know, it's part of the Constitution. But this actually shows you a map of the states that ratified the ERA versus those that didn't. You even have a handful of states that ratified it, but then voted to rescind the ERA, including Tennessee and Kentucky. Notice one part of the country just
looks
did
like
not
the old
support it.
Confederacy, Dr. Greene.
You might be right there, bro.
Oh, my goodness. Important point, folks.
I mean,
goodness.
there are sometimes coincidences in history Oh, there.
Okay, we're back.
Okay, thanks. So what I'm gonna do is just, I think I'll stop with the images for right now, just that helps it all. But the basic point is this. By the 70s and 80s, despite the gains of the civil rights movement, despite the anti-war movement and the like, what you see by the 80s is the new right is resurgent under Richard Nixon, later Ronald Reagan. And they are trying to, again, as Bill Fletcher said yesterday, trying to basically revoke the 20th century, trying to overturn the Great Society, the New Deal, the progressive movement, everything that folks had taken for granted in the late 20th century. And again, I think as we're seeing today in the here and now, the idea of revoking the 20th century no longer seems so far-fetched, especially if you read up on things like Project 2025 and the like. The good news, and this is really important, is that just because the far right had made these gains in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it didn't mean that folks had given up on fighting for social justice in the South or across the country. Now, one of the things that becomes incredibly critical to all of this is organizations like GROW, the Grassroots Organizing Workshop. And I want to show this one last image, and I'll turn things over to Brett, talk about GROW. But I'm sure you guys have seen this image before, this photograph of Modjeska Simkins in front of a jobs, peace, and equality sign. I have this photograph hangs proudly in my office at Clap. It's actually one of the first things students see when they walk into my office space. But I want you to think a second about Modjeska Simkins, right? As we saw in the documentary about her life, as we discussed heavily in this course this semester, Modjeska Simkins throughout the 20th century was involved in just about every civil and human rights movement you can think of. And by the 1970s and 80s, Ms. Simkins was as busy as ever before, because there were a hell of a lot of movements going on for a wide range of issues that still, many of which still plague us today. One of them, of course, being the anti-nuclear movement. Again, this becomes really important in the 80s with the Cold War escalating to a point of almost having a third world war, participation in the anti-apartheid movement, things like that. But also folks like Brett and many others who were involved in these social movements were well aware of the fact that they were up against some very nasty forces. We had Lewis Pitts here recently to talk to us about his work in the movement. Again, he was involved with the aftermath of the Greensboro Massacre, 1979, where 5 activists were murdered by members of the Klan and neo-Nazis in broad daylight. November 3rd, 1979. Again, a lot of these things that we're talking about now and the movements that Brett's about to talk about as well are movements and causes that are still very important in the here and now. And that shouldn't discourage us from thinking about the work that we have to do. Instead, it should encourage us to think about the fact that we are not doing this work alone, that in fact we have resources to draw upon, and that this history does make a great deal of difference because we can draw from it for movements today and movements tomorrow. All right, so with that said, I want to bring this story much closer to home, and this is, of course, where Brett Bursey comes into the picture. And again, I will just say this. I think tonight's class will once again prove my argument that Brett should write a memoir quite well. So again, Brett, come on up.
So I want to talk about the new left not being that new. It's the ideas that the new left carried from the previous new left. And that idea, the main idea was exemplified by this woman in my life. This was my link to the values and positions that we considered to be the new left. To what happened when I got involved and what was pretty primarily in the late 60s, a civil rights movement. And it was being limited in its reach and scope by people that were driving the train, whose aspirations for their own value, their own advancement became primary. That the civil rights, many people, myself and Modjeska certainly included, and many of the W.E.B. Du Bois people, saw the civil rights movement and its ultimate victory as a concession, as a loss for the gains and power that was built up by the militant human rights movement that this woman's mother was involved in 1905 with Du Bois and the Niagara movement. There was a linear line of people that had those elements that we see as the New Left, which was an anti-imperialist perspective that saw the global issue and the connections to the domestic problems in America. Not only the relationship of those, but the moving force in many of those issues around the world, and certainly domestically, was the United States of America. And so I just want to point out that Ms. Simkins is in front of a sign there, that jobs, peace, justice, and equality. That sign was probably from I ran for public office. I was her campaign manager, and I think it was 81, and that she ran for city council for this district right here against E.W. Cromartie, who was a lawyer he was a black lawyer, but he was for green power. He literally talked about green power instead of black power. But that poster,
Spectrum.
but anyway, I'm talking about this New Left being really a continuation of an ideological understanding and a commitment of people that have been doing the same thing for a long time. It just gets covered up and suppressed because we upset the status quo. And so the New Left is a child of the old left, both of them upsetting the status quo because we wanted to change the value systems of this country. And the value systems of this country are clearly about money and profit. Some people call it capitalism. It's such a bad word we don't want to be associated with because it sounds like a buzzword and it makes us like foreigners. But it is actually not in the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that everything that drives this country has to be money. Thomas Jefferson actually changed the Bill of Rights from protecting our life, liberty, and property to our life, liberty, and happiness. And I would suggest that we've got a lot of work to do to actually make that change from property or money or wealth to happiness.
Was that Rousseau?
Sir?
Was that Rousseau? Was that his?
Rousseau, Thomas Jefferson.
No, I mean, but that phrase that came from like the French, it was a French philosopher.
Oh, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yeah, okay, that said life, liberty, and property.
Right.
And that's what, when Jefferson went to use in the US Constitution, he changed property to
happiness.
yeah.
Right. And one of our tropes here is that we are the originalists in terms of supporting the vision and the aspirations of the founding documents that they didn't make. They didn't get there. We're still not there, but we can still lift up those values that they put down for us to guide the government. Because the question is, who governs? It's not the government, it's the governance that's the problem. If we were in charge, things would be better. So it's our turn to try and be able to gain the power to be the ones that determine the implementation of the government's rules. But I got involved at a time when civil rights, segregation was the law of the land. It's clearly in your face. There was no way to avoid the fact that I could go into the front door of something, and if I'm with a black person, they'd have to go in the back door. And I graduated from a segregated high school in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1966. And this is what 54 was the time that the Briggs case and conjoined with the Brown case ended public segregation. So 54, 65, that's 12 years later. That was not all deliberate speed that was in the ruling of the Brown case. It was slow walk. They're backing up now. They've been slow walking for decades, and now they're walking more rapidly backwards. With we're in an age of post-hypocrisy, we have this period when John West and other people that were the liberals having to understand that they've got to be not as threatening to Black people to be able to win elections in South Carolina. There was a time when there was greater civility, and there was a time when there was obedience given to the question of equality where they gave lip service to it. That period's over with. In 2002, you heard Dr. Greene say just a minute ago, there were no Black elected officials, certainly in the legislature or in the executive office, until 1970. And so from 1970 to 2002, the white people left the Democratic Party, started leaving in 2002, started leaving before that. Well, 2002 was when the last person that was necessary changed parties and changed from a Democrat to Republican. And that gave the Senate, the all-white Senate, control. And then by 2000, but in 2002, we became a Republican trifecta, which means that all three bodies of the government, the House, the Senate, the executive, and the judiciary, throw them in, were controlled by the majority party, which is the white supremacist party. Again, it was a white supremacist party from the Democrats from the end of Reconstruction up until 1970, and then it became the white supremacist party of Republicans in 2002. And so all they did was change their hats. And so a lot of people weren't fooled, but that the civil rights movement, as I mentioned, that there are people that felt that we lost that which it was that Modjeska was fighting for, and other people were fighting for. And many of you heard me say that when she was called a civil rights worker, she would correct you. She'd say civil rights are what they can grant you and take away. I'm a human rights worker, and you can't take that away from me. That's my right as a human. And so that's something that is very difficult to talk about to people that uphold all the Black leadership that we've had during this time period that worked to the status quo. If you want to play in that game, you have to play by those rules. And it's very difficult, very, very difficult. You look back at Julian Bond winning a seat in the Georgia legislature in 1968, they wouldn't seat him because he was against the Vietnam War. That same year, Modjeska wrote a op-ed for the radio station, the radio program that she had called Woke Up This Morning with Freedom on My Mind. And she wrote something that talked about the Vietnam War and about how teaching children to go halfway around the world and kill people was not going to end well. And they wouldn't run that. But there was a pressure against people being against the status quo. And that, so Bond was elected in 68. I knew people that were elected in North Carolina legislature in 68. It wasn't until 1992 that we had some progressive legislators elected that had not been the ones chosen by the white majority. And that the three that were the first ones up, Ms. Simkins pushed Felder. Felder was working with progressive elements, and Felder was a lawyer at the time. And so that in the main, people that were winning were people that were chosen by the white power structure. And that's still certainly a dynamic in terms of money, but now we have a situation where the control is solidified by the status quo with racial and political gerrymandering. And so Black people can win. As a matter of fact, they win in seats that only Black people can win because they basically pushed all the Black people into, I think it's 18 of the 46 districts. And so if all the Black people vote, they can't change anything because their votes are diminished by the fact that they're packed into districts and they can only elect so many people. Like, for instance, Jim Clyburn has always had like 15, 25% more people than 50%. And so the people that in that district can vote for one person, but their vote, if they spread those votes out and put them in districts adjoining them, they could elect more people. And so that we're locked into a path that we can't get out of by doing the same thing that got us in that path, which is letting the people that run the status quo maintain their values about property and capital, draw the rules, and they get to draw the rules of the game that they play. So that's a dynamic that we've seen people fighting for decades before there was a new left that I had the opportunity to be involved in the late 60s. And my entree into it was about the civil rights movement. And I don't need to tell you horror stories about growing up in racist South Carolina. These sort of things, and they're true. But it was a time when it wasn't legal anymore in the 60s, but it was certainly tolerated. I mean, up until the Brown ruling, it was de jure. And so we had that period where we saw the rise of the American Nazis in the 30s that were supporting Hitler, and supporting the National Socialist Party with white supremacy. In the 30s, it was legal to be a white supremacist American. And so it wasn't, a program to have 20,000 white guys in Madison Square Garden doing the Sieg Heil at the time. So the history is, it doesn't necessarily what to say, it doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And we're seeing somewhat of the same thing happening. We're now in a position where hopefully there was a conviction recently that's going to help slow that down some, but we're in a position of post-hypocrisy. There was this long period where people wouldn't admit they were stone cold racist. And now we have people that are running and organizing around a white Christian nationalist government. And that there are things that people are digging up that are happening with the right wing about moving toward, I think Bill said last night, a theocracy, that there's paperwork's being drawn in terms of really lifting up the Christian nature, the white Christian nature of the founding fathers, and claiming that that's where we need to be. But the work that I was doing when it started out with the civil rights movement, very shortly, I was only involved in 66, 7, 8, and 9, and 70. The war in Vietnam was like the bright light that made a lot of people realize and connect the dots that what we're doing in Vietnam is colonialism, and equating that to the type of repression of Black people in this country. And that what the analysis went then was, in order to maintain a healthy, vibrant, and ruling capitalist free market in this country, we need to offshore what we would see as the traditional proletarian oppression. So if you think about the kind of the classical Marxism, you have the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, that own things, and then the working class. And so there's this mythical middle class that's been created, and the middle class is this buffer that the ruling class creates and allows white people and upwardly mobile Negroes to participate in the privilege of a white predatory system. And that the oppression you offshore, you have colonies like the Vietnam War. America got involved in helping the French recolonize Vietnam. And so that's offshore. And we had this offshoring stuff going on. Well, I guess it's probably still happening in Gaza, but that it was something that started coming back. They would say that chickens are coming home to roost during these worldwide revolutions of liberation struggles all over the world in the 60s. And so that was waking up people, building the new left understanding of the commonality of oppression. And I think that new left, the essence of it is understanding the commonality of oppression. If they can oppress me, they can oppress you. And so whatever it is that we are suffering from is coming from the same source. And that's one of the really sad parts we see of the ability of the people that run the status quo to deflect our ability to have a unified front. And if your front is basically support rich white guys and they all get behind it, it makes them very powerful. And the Democrats draw the people that are more sensitive about individuality and rights and all. And I'll jump forward in time to just talk about us starting the Progressive Network, starting a Progressive Caucus in 2000 with the South Carolina Democratic Party. And we were the only caucus that represented everybody. And the largest constituent group in the Democratic Party was Black women. And there were no Black women on the podium. And so we had the power for 14 years to be able to control the floor of the convention. Because we were the delegates, we were the rank and file, we were the people from all over the state that believed in the principles and platforms of the Democratic Party. And after we continued to embarrass them several times by being able to take the floor and call them out for not supporting different things, like they wouldn't come out against the anti-gay marriage amendment. They were very, very hesitant in supporting the Medicaid expansion. That they created caucuses. They wrote bylaws to create caucuses that we found unethical because the caucuses had to support the platform. Well, we've always supported the platform. We generally wrote the platform. South Carolina Democratic Party didn't even support the national platform. But the bylaws I wrote said that the caucuses had to support the platform and the candidates. But the candidates didn't have to support the platform. So we pulled out. It was unethical. And then their new bylaws required the caucuses to be cheering parties for the Democratic Party. There's 13 caucuses now. They fight amongst themselves. They can't get anything done. That's just a lesson that we see happening historically, of pitting people off against each other and how they manipulate us. And part of it's driven by this sacred notion of us being really important individuals and having identity politics as opposed to politics that fit us all, common value politics. But we got together after the war wound down and civil rights bills were passed. And in the early 70s, I had finished a 2-year prison sentence for protesting the war in Vietnam and was organizing in Columbia, South Carolina. I impeached Nixon was some of the first stuff we did. And that we were building a cadre of people that were the graduates from the civil rights movement and the graduates from the anti-war movement. And that's what constituted GROW, the grassroots organizing workshop, that started as a meeting, a weekly meeting in people's houses, talking about stuff. And there was a sense that we really did need to institutionalize to have a phone and a place that people could go to. And so we found an old building that was in rather dilapidated shape. It was a big 2-story building that's in Olympia now, if you're interested. Some of you have been there before. And so it should have a little marker in front of it. But we were there for a number of years for nothing because it didn't have a roof on it hardly, and we did this work on it. And so we moved in 1977, got the building. But leading up to that, we had been meeting. And so there was a vibrant core of people to do the work. And that vibrant core included people that I've been working with when I met Modjeska, with what we call, it was a work collective. And you know what a commune is, like communal or common value or communism. I'm not sure how those all got mixed together. But there was a place on Pickens Street called the 221 Pickens Cooperative that was a health food restaurant and had some stores, items like grains and whatnot. And that was a co-op. And in the back of it, we had a woodworking shop. And I was involved, after I got out of jail, I was involved in the woodworking shop. It was the Red Potato Work Collective. And then it was called the Red Potato because one of our people spent time in the Peace Corps in some country in Africa, I can't remember. And he was all excited about calling it the Red Potato because Red Potato, it might have been a sweet potato, I don't know, but the red potato was something that was so valuable and precious and appreciated by these people, they couldn't eat it and they gave it to their friends. And I'm saying, excuse me, we're not working for free. But anyway, we kept the name. And so the Red Potato, I opened the first bank account at Victory Savings Bank, and I think it was 74, when Modjeska Simkins was the teller in a little brick building on Hardin Street across from Allen University. And that's how I met her. And it's really a shame because she knew me in the 60s. She knew me when I was getting arrested in the 60s. We know that because we have clippings when I cleaned out the little house behind her house. I'm pointing because that's her house next door, and behind it there's a little house. And she let me clean out that house in the early 80s because one of our staff people's mother was ill, living on an Indian reservation in Oklahoma. We brought her out here to help her be better. And Modjeska let me clean up that house, and I sent truckloads of things to Carroll, Indiana. And they're now, most of them are part of the Modjeska Simpkins collection. And if I'd had them, the mice would have eaten them. But Modjeska had that little house full of stuff. There was like a warren of papers stacked up head high. And the depth of her reading and her knowledge in something was incredible. But she was clearly New Left or pre-New Left. She came left, and she was raised that way. But the work that we then did with the grassroots organizing workshop was really classical stuff. It was like base building, or we were doing. We started a food cooperative with locals in Bluff Road. The old Grove building was on an old piece of Bluff Road, and you go out probably 10 miles into the country there. A very black district in Richland County, and started a food co-op, the Grove Food Co-op. And when Carter got elected, was that 76? We had been working on building Grow Up, and we got Vistas, Volunteers in Service to America, which was referred to as the Domestic Peace Corps. And Carter had appointed people that were leftist. He appointed Vietnam veterans to head up the Peace Corps. And John Lewis, who you may remember, John Lewis from SCLC and then became a congressman from Georgia, he was in charge of Vista. He was our Vista coordinator that we met with at Penn Center in 78, 79. We had Vistas until Ronald Reagan came to town. That was a really scary time for people. I mean, Ronald Reagan was a drugstore truck driving man, had the Ku Klux Klan. That's a song that was played when he was governor of California. But he scared a lot of people and did some things that caused us to organize against some of the things he was doing, like the attempt to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. It was a socialist government, and we have a long, long history of destabilizing foreign governments, especially in small countries, that somehow think either the oil under their ground or the magnesium of the tin in their ground or the bananas on their trees is America's to plunder. And so we will destabilize your country and make you be able to take the benefits of the free market. And so we were trying to get rid of the Sandinistas, as we had done in so many Central American countries. And Congress passed a law against destabilizing Nicaragua with military. And so we joined a pledge of resistance. It was a national thing. And we printed posters, which we'll find one someday and put it up, a pledge of resistance poster. And people signed that if X happened, then I will go to my congressman's office and stay there and be arrested. And that never happened. The Sandinistas stabilized their government, and then it went south later. But that was the type of commitment that I think would be beautiful to see with Gaza. I think that direct action and being arrested, it's like it sets the compass for people to understand what's so wrong that people are doing this. And there are instances I'll speak of that we did direct action that I think really helped change the dialogue and help really make some headway. The Vietnam War was certainly one of them. There were, when the bombing of Cambodia happened, it was an incursion into a country that we weren't at war with. And it resulted in 380 universities in this country going on strike. The University of South Carolina was one of them. And we've talked a lot about that. And Becky's book, pull up one of her books, Yanni. Becky's book, Generation No, it has a section in it that you need to be reading about the period that we're talking about. So it saves me some time. And the 380 universities that went on strike, South Carolina was one of them, and there were over 600 people arrested in about 3 days at the university. But that happened on a large scale, huge scale, and it just put so much pressure against them. We started seeing the war in Vietnam winding down. I think that the work that we did on the anti-nuclear movement had much the same effect. But let me see what we're at. Yeah, the National Guard, I want to talk about that. The Grove did we were not in a mature enough analysis or not understanding the circumstances, and they were different, to have the state-based analysis that we have now to understand we've got to change SC before we can change DC. But we were doing things, we did a lot of environmental work. In 1978, we got our 501c3 in the name of the Natural Guard. And the Natural Guard was this thing where you commit your life, your fortune, and your sacred honor to the defense of the earth and its inhabitants. And that it was quite something. And we had our own flags. And the first big thing that we did, we actually spent some time before we worked here. I think it was in '77. We went to the first big anti-nuclear demonstration in Seabrook, New Hampshire, with a crew of people, and were arrested amongst 1,400 people. And that what was the pushback from the status quo was, these people are the old communists, or these people are the anti-war people. And yeah, that's right. It all fits together in our head. But we organized the Natural Guard looking at initially the Savannah River plant. And we had, some of the creative graphics we have, that sign up there that says no nukes on it. That's quoting that song that you just heard Jackson Browne singing. That song was big the year we printed that poster. Jackson Browne did concerts for us. Jackson Browne sang two sellout shows at the Township Auditorium that I got to introduce him at. And gave me a paper bag full of $17,000 in cash after the show. But it was a tremendous sense of collectivity and shared values, and fun. It was fun too, which is really important. And that the Natural Guard organized a big conference on the nuclear fuel cycle. And we helped develop a cycle of protest that started with the mining on native land, and then went to the fabrication, and we had people arrested at Westinghouse or on Bluff Road. So the mining, the fabrication of the fuel, and the utilities, the reactors, all over the country. And there was thousands of people arrested. The BC Summer plant, not the one that failed, but the one that they started building in '78. I lived 3.5 miles from it. And so I figured I would intervene because I already knew that this was a wonderful opportunity to expose absolute predatory capitalism. Plus, I don't like nuclear power. And that, think about it for a minute. You know how many people die every day because of oil? Because it's the way that they run things. It's the reason we don't have mass transit. It's the reason we can't get out from under General Motors, et cetera. So they own the oil. What if there was a fuel that no one owned? And so plutonium. You could make plutonium. Nobody owns it. And so they're moving in a direction of using things that make the value greater. And so we were opposed. Jimmy Carter was opposed to the plutonium economy. He was a nuclear physicist who had been on nuclear submarines. And the big plant in Barnwell that was our first target was one that he sided with us and had an executive order about not using it. But we had 250 people arrested there in 1978. That we had 5,000 people come to a soybean field outside of Barnwell, right outside the gate of the bomb plant. We were there for a year with our Vistas. A Vista salary, I can't remember how much it was, but it was intentionally enough to keep you in touch with the poor people you're supposed to be helping. And so we started with 10, we ended up with 14 Vistas because we were the cool Vista place. But we had people in Barnwell for a year, paid for by the federal government to protest the federal government. And that's what democracy looks like. And so we were able to meet with farmers and all that didn't have any appreciation for the nuclear waste and whatnot. Pacifying the neighborhood, had alternative energy shows we took to the schools, and turned out over 5,000 people in a soybean field for this rally. We had a press conference at the State House before it happened. We had John Goffman, who's the founder of plutonium, the father of plutonium, who said on the State House steps that the Savannah River plant is the greatest threat to national security there is, that conventional weapons dropped on the bomb plant would require the evacuation of the entire East Coast. And depending on the weather, and he cited all this, like depending on the weather, you had like 12 hours to get everybody out of Washington, and 14 hours to get everybody out of Boston and then New York City, and that it doesn't go away. It's still there. There's 35 million gallons of nuclear waste still there. But that the reactor portion, now the reactor portion, the commercial stuff and the military stuff are two different monsters. The reactor stuff pretty well wore itself down because it just was too damn expensive. And the DC Summer plant outside of town, out by Jenkinsville, was the last nuclear reactor built and operated. It was 78th reactor, and it was going to be it was the only reactor that I wanted to be an intervener because I knew that all these reactors had been built and people intervened and they raised hell. There were no public hearings. Nobody intervened because it was the power company. You know, y'all know FCNG, we trust them. And so I got to intervene. I filed late, but I lived 3.5 miles from ground zero. I was in the emergency evacuation zone. And so I was an intervener and I had federal subpoena power for 4 years. I subpoenaed everybody. I subpoenaed all the directors of the state agencies that had a role in the evacuation plan, and they didn't even know it. They didn't know they were going to commandeer all their buses and save all the students. And it really irritated a lot of people. And we subpoenaed the head of SLED, who had personally arrested me more than once, and sent Merle and Steve Bates, who's the ACLU guy, to deliver the subpoena to him like at 11 o'clock at night. And he's yelling, "Bursey, is that you?" No, that's not me. I wasn't there. But it was really a sense of awesome power and the rule of law. When you're the law, kicks ass, let me say. And so I was involved in the nuclear hearings for 5 years. We had a room at the Grosvenor, and it turned out to be Becky's office, that had a wall of all of their books, of all of their stuff, of all their specifications. And we were able to require them to do things they didn't want to do because I knew people that worked there, and they would come to me and tell me about, they put the pressure vessel down, which the pressure vessel is, you know, a stainless steel pot that they have extreme heat and radiation in. They bring it on a special rail car because it's so huge, and they lower it down on bolts that are this big, and they missed one. And so the guys took the saw and cut it off and put it on, just put this thing on. We made them dig it up. So we kept getting stuff that was really embarrassing them. But by the end of the day, after all the hearings, and after bringing in people to testify, and after bringing in experts to talk about it, the first plant manager thanked me. He said, "We've got a safer plant because of you. You could do things I couldn't do that would fire me." So that's, again, that's the adversary role that citizens can play under the federal government rules. So if those rules are used properly, we have a lot more power. And so we have to figure out how to engage those fights and win those fights. So that the reactor was built and runs. We had a whole bunch of people arrested there. But that the one that they built more recently, this is jumping ahead in the time frame, but that reactor was an attempt to restart the nuclear industry. The last one was started in '78, licensed in like '82, and that it went for 30 years. I can't do the math real quick because there's no money in it. I mean, it's really expensive, and people weren't building them, and it caused a lot of hoo-ha with people getting arrested in your front yard. And so I knew that there's something was coming this way that was bad by the American Legislative Exchange Council, which writes really bad legislation to support the status quo. To be able to rejuvenate the nuclear industry, they needed several things. One, they needed to waive again the liability. So please don't hold us responsible if the thing blows up and kills a whole bunch of people. And so Congress did that. They needed federal money, and George W. Bush passed that. I think he was president at the time. And then they needed a really friendly, business-friendly state to pass a law that would allow, the other thing was the Fed said, okay, you can do a model and have one hearing. We used to have construction hearing and then an operating hearing. So they could build the thing before they could run it, which who's going to do that? So they have a conjoined license, Feds did that. The other things the Feds did, warmed it up, and now they need a state to change the way they get paid. Because you used not to get paid until you flip the switch and made electricity. So they passed a law that allowed them to start billing as soon as they put the first shovel in the ground. SC&G is charging the customers. I saw that coming. I knew that was happening. And it failed in a couple states. Tried in Georgia, didn't fail in Georgia, and they built a successful reactor there. But came here, and I'm like, this is another one of my Chicken Little things. I'm the only one that knows this. I'm in the middle, middle of reality, waving my hand, stop, turn back, and watch this bill that was called a consumer-friendly bill, because the argument was we're going to let everybody pay a little bit as we build it, so so your grandchildren go get stuck with a big bill. Okay. Well, the fact is, the grandchildren got stuck with a big bill and nothing's built because of those problems that any of us that have been involved in would have been able to point out that the frailty of that way of boiling water isn't a good way to make money. And so it's not going to happen again, probably in our lifetime, that after that 30-year cessation of building nuclear reactors, we have a big hole in the ground here, a $9 billion hole in the ground, that we had intimate understanding of why it shouldn't be built, tried to stop it at the legislature. I have a piece that we need to include in the reading called, I think it's Power Play, and that it outlines the way that bill, the SC&G hired the McNair firm, Governor McNair's firm, to write the bill to fit South Carolina. Alex sends these things out, literally says your state name goes here. And so you got to find somebody to fix it, make it fit the state. So the McNair firm wrote the bill, gave it to the legislature. The McNair firm made lots of donations to the legislature. We have all followed the money. We're going to talk about what the Progressive Network did and following the money next class. But it's really revelatory if you can follow the money and see the money trail to the people that voted. That bill, I was ready for public hearings in the House. They didn't have any. The person that was the chair of the House was a chair of an Alex committee that wrote the original boilerplate bill that then gave it to the former governor that then handed it to them, and they passed it with no hearings, went to the floor in 3 days, and then passed in the House, went to the Senate. And that the Senate champion in the Republican House is the Democratic Party candidate for governor. It passed in like 4 or 5 days. And then we got a $9 billion hole that they're blaming on the power company. And I suggested that they should look in the mirror to find the real crook there. But the stuff that we were doing, the environmental work that we were doing, we followed the money. The nuclear work we're doing, follow the money. The war work we're doing, follow the money. So the commonality of understanding what's driving the bad people to do stuff is clear. And so our target is the people that don't benefit from the work that they do and the values that they have. Sam Owens, when we started working with Modjeska, it grow. She was on our board. She was our guru, our advisor, and whatnot. She wouldn't come upstairs. If you ever saw the stairs, you would realize why she never came upstairs. When she came, we had to go downstairs. But there was just a couple things that we did with her. A young man who had he was mentally not well, known by the community to be such, was causing trouble. Somebody called the police, and they're trying to tell the cop, no, he's just crazy. Cop shot him, killed him. And Sam Owens was his name. And this is in the early 80s, I think it's like 81 or 2, when Kamaya Marsharia, who was a comrade that's been involved with us for many years, was organizing in Winsboro, and this was in Winsboro, and organized a march from Winsboro to Columbia about the killing of Sam Owens and the need to have somebody that could intervene in mental health crises other than people with guns, which we're still talking about here and haven't done it. And so I remember being on the march, and some sled guy come and said, I didn't know this was your issue. And I told him, I said, well, there's only one issue. And he went off scratching his head. But that Modjeska had that one issue thing. I remember marching with Modjeska around the Wells Fargo Bank up by the State House. when we were picketing them for selling cougarans, and the university was buying cougarans to support apartheid in South Africa. And I took Modjeska to a clan meeting one time just to, she wanted to go show them that she wasn't afraid of them.
Cool.
And then she was one of our regular speakers at our anti-nuclear stuff. And Modjeska was one of the few women of color that went to that meeting in Houston for the ERA passage. And so she was somebody that connected those dots. And so that's very important. That's the fuel for the New Left, was the dot connectors. I'm going to really briefly touch a couple other things so we have some time for questions. One of the really interesting things I got to be involved in was being involved with the Federation for Progress, which used to be the Communist Workers' Party, which that poster was. I went to a Federation for Progress meeting with the Rainbow Coalition to be formed, a forming meeting for the Rainbow Coalition in 1984 after the Democratic Convention where Jesse ran for president. Jesse had made everybody cried at his speech. It was very powerful. And so this is after the convention at San Francisco State University. There's a meeting to see if we're going to form a Rainbow Coalition. And there's a fellow named Jack Odell, who is all people attribute Odell to be one of the great thinkers of the Black liberation struggle. And he was Jesse's advisor. And Odell, we're in a room with people from all over the country talking about bringing together a unified force that connects the dots. And the debate was, are we going to call, we're going to have a call coming out of this convention for the Rainbow Coalition to host, picking up the March on Washington, picking up the Jobs for Freedom stuff, and are we going to do that? And Jack Odell said, this is very famous words that I will never forget. We can't have a Rainbow Coalition unless we put JJ in a box. Unless we can keep Jesse Jackson from being the leader, it's going to be Jesse's thing. While we were having that debate, Jesse was outside calling a press conference announcing we were doing what it was we were talking about doing. While we were talking about not letting him do that. That's evidence of that which is, it continues to hamstring us, of people organizing in ways that gratifies their ego, that they think that they're the only ones that can save us. I think we got one that just got 34 convictions because he was the only one that could save us. But we see that certainly on a local level. And that I'm just lifting that up as an example that really set the movement back. And that's what we have to be mindful of, trying to never let movement people become our politicians. Oh, Jack Odell passed probably 2 years ago, pushing 100. Jack was a student at the 1946 conference at Township Auditorium that Modjeska put together. That's a small circle. We started a print shop in 1981. The Harbinger publications that you see, our Union Bug on stuff. We've had a Union print shop since '81. We wouldn't be here if we hadn't had what's now a new thing that people have found, independent revenue generation. Some of the big foundations are saying, wow, you can start something and actually make money. And it's 501c3. So at Grow, we had a cafe, like 7 people working in it. We had a print shop, another 7 people working in it. We had started a newspaper, statewide newspaper in 1991. The Point, which was when Becky came to us and submitted an article because the Bar Association wouldn't run it, about the only state that wouldn't allow anonymous testing for AIDS because the Christian Coalition. And Becky checked in and never found the door to leave. So she's still here with us 32 years later. And that's a cover of David Beasley opposing the motor voter law. And that's Charlie Condon on his. So the fellow that drew these cartoons was a gift. He was a very old fellow who had retired, living here in Columbia. That I'm hoping that we can get all these covers scanned and available online. The printing press, there's a quick story on that, and then I'm going to be quiet so we can take some questions. The printing press that printed so much of the material for the left in South Carolina for many years was a direct result of a sign that we had permission to put up on the State House grounds, that I think, Robert, you may have a picture of that sign, that you remember back the Nicaragua thing and the troops on the border? While the Congress had said we can't do it, some right-wing governors said, well, we'll send the National Guard. Same thing that's happening at the borders of Mexico now. The right-wing governor sending troops to Mexico. I mean, to the borders of Mexico. And so we made a sign that said, remember Vietnam, keep South Carolina National Guard out of Central America with our phone number on it. And there was a time when you could put these signs up on the grounds of the State House if you were 501c3. And they had little holes in the ground with little cans in them, and you had to make your sign with a 4-foot part that drops right in there. And so we went through, we gave them what it was going to say, it got approved. And we went to put the sign up, and the ground people said, you can't put the sign up. I said, why? They said, we changed the rules. I said, when? They said, this morning. And so we started looking into that, and Carroll Campbell, governor at the time, tried to, but he didn't try to stop it, he did stop it. And he accused people like Bursey of being the fault that his brother died in Vietnam. But this is a time when Democrats had several seats on the Budget Control Board, which ran everything, especially State House grounds. So there were several Democrats on the Budget and Control Board. Bob Guile, one of our members and a lawyer from way back, he was our attorney who took depositions from the Democrats on the Budget Control Board who said, oh yeah, the governor was extremely obsessed with it. He said, they had 8 meetings ago, and the governor, they had to tell the governor, you can't just ban Bursey's sign or Grove's sign. I mean, he's well, okay, ban all signs. And so they banned all signs. And so we had all of that on record. We sued and went to federal court, and the governor was called to testify. He tried to get out of it. They made him come testify. He lied through his teeth. He said he didn't know anything about it. And it was all about safety. The sign could fall over and crush a child, or somebody be driving down Assembly Street and see the sign and have a wreck. And so it was all about public safety. And so it was ridiculous. And the federal judge said at some point after the governor testified, I would be remiss at this point if I did not issue a directed verdict of guilty. The parties have until 10 o'clock in the morning to have a settlement on my desk. And so at 10 o'clock the next morning, they handed us a $50,000 check.
Oh,
And we bought.
Oh,
We bought our only new printing press that we ever had and printed left-wing material for years and years and years until the thing ran out of steam and we couldn't get the computer on it to service anymore. And so it's now in some village in India where people are smarter than we are, and they took the computer off and hopefully running it. But that's a good ending for the story. And Becky wanted to play a clip from Chris Kinney at Grow. Do we want to do that, Becky? I mean, Chris Kinney graduating.
That's a
Yeah.
20-minute clip. I think let's go ahead and take some questions because I think that, yeah, let's take questions.
Well, we're going to have another chance, another bite at this apple at next class to lift up the Progressive Network. And the clip that she's talking about is Chris graduating from the Modjeska School in this room a couple of months before he died. And it's really moving about his talking about his experiences at Grow years later at Modjeska School. So this fits in both classes. So we'll do it next time. And so there may be no questions. Do you have any questions about how you are inheriting a group that goes back generations, but it's new in South Carolina, the new left of South Carolina? Yes, ma'am.
Talking about Lee Atwater's interview, when we were talking about how he said shifting towards economic policy that was like veiled racism, doesn't that require voters to be more informed of how politics work, how economics work? Do you think that that's why like the blatantly racist rhetoric coming from politicians like Trump is picking up steam lately? Because it requires a certain level of education and voters to be able to see through.
Civic education is not something that we spend much time on, certainly in South Carolina. I mean, we actually are having laws now banning our own history. I mean, in many states, the government takes a role in educating citizens about who's running and what their positions are. In South Carolina, the government has no role in educating citizens about how it works and who's running. And we have to find out, I have to find out who's running election after election dispatch, which supports Trump. And so there's a deliberative effort to keep us stupid. so they can get away with what they're doing. I mean, it was a reasonable question, but you're not in a reasonable society, man.
Also, to add to that answer, I wanted to make a point of clarification. I mentioned earlier that it was H.R. Haldeman who gave an interview where he said that the Nixon administration launched a war on drugs to actually cripple Black political power. It wasn't Haldeman, it was John Ehrlichman who said that. So it wasn't that bad Nixon advisor, it was the other bad Nixon advisor who said that. Any other questions? Got some time for questions.
Let me do that dot connecting thing one more time, where we talked about Lee Atwater being this really, really, really bad influence. And he died when he was like in his mid-40s from brain cancer. And I drank beer with him a couple of times, a really personable guy, played the blues guitar really good, but saw politics as a sport and didn't mind hurting people doing it. But his mentee, his mentor was Harry Dent. And Harry Dent was Nixon's advisor. And Harry Dent's advisor was Jimmy Burns. And Jimmy Burns we know about, we talk about Jimmy. But these are people that are affecting not only national politics, South Carolina politics, that's why international politics. Because Jimmy Burns' mentor was Ben Tillman. We got Ben Tillman, Jimmy Burns, Harry Dent, Lee Atwater, Paul Manafort, and the people around Trump now. There's not a stellar capable figure that can stay out of jail working now with the Republican Party connected with South Carolina. But there are way too many people involved doing the bad things that are connected to South Carolina. Manafort is one of the two people that was working with Jim DeMint that organized the entity called the Conservative Partnership. The Partnership for Conservatism has an education program and a election integrity program. The election integrity program is going out and suing people all over, and the woman that's in charge of that was one of the people that was the co-chair with Mark Meadows on the education program. That the one in South Carolina, the woman that is now the superintendent of education in South Carolina, was their mentee. She worked for Jim DeMint. She's now directs public education, came directly from a model program that came out of the Partnership for Conservatism to destroy public education. So we have that type of influence, and the two people that are running that show were both indicted with Trump. There's a hand up with Cecil Raby.
Cecil, go ahead, please.
Thanks a lot. This is always really informative. After my teaching stint, my wife Irene and I moved to Columbia. We were there when Campbell was governor, and I was managing the 3 Capitol newsstands right there on Main Street in front of the Capitol. And we had copies of The Point coming in to the building. And it was rather interesting, a little funny to watch. We were frequented by all kinds of aides and representatives who would come in wanting their papers for archive purposes, things like that. And Tucker Eskew was among those who would come in. Of course, the governor's spokesperson, and later, wasn't he a speechwriter for Bush, I think? Or anyway, he would always grab the point. It was like you open the door and he wanted it, but he would fold it up and put it inside his jacket so no one could see. And it was rather humorous to watch how people would scarf it up, but they didn't want their colleagues to know that they were getting it. And we were also there for the Harry Dent funeral, and it was excuse me, Irene, Lee Atwater funeral. Yeah, Lee Atwater funeral. And Tucker was on the Boogeyman video, if I remember correctly. But those are the little connections we had. But I do have a really short trivia question. I loved reading The Point. I always wanted to know who wrote Loose Lips.
Becky, you gonna tell him?
I'm not telling.
Oh, come on. Oh, man.
But, Cecil, you bring up a story that's worth repeating, that we didn't get the picture. I had people call me, they were in the balcony, and we had dropped a point, and I can't even remember which issue it was. But the legislature in the House, everybody was reading point. It would have been a great commercial for us. But I mean, we had things in there, like, I remember you just saw one cover with David Beasley on it. We had another cover with Beasley on it when he was running for governor, that was done by Kwashi, is it Kwashi Campbell, Kwashi Colin? Really, really fine artist in Charleston. And Beasley's on the cover, and he's in cleric garb with a collar, but you can see very faintly horns. And it was just really, really striking. And I spent several days in Darlington County doing this story about Beasley. And I quoted something I was told, David's father owned a bank. And if you had a mortgage, you didn't have a David for governor poster in your front yard, your mortgage got called in. But somebody told me up there, and you'll have to excuse the language because it's a good old Southern quote. He said, it's a final, so, and David was the youngest legislator. He was a legislator when he was an undergraduate. And he was a Democrat. And then he was elected Republican governor in 94, I think it was. Yeah. And so the quote was, in the point, it's a fine old Southern tradition for Daddy to buy his stupidest son a seat in the legislature to keep him from fucking up the family business. A fine old Southern tradition. And I was quite certain if we had printed 10,000 more of those, David wouldn't have been governor. But we did print up 35,000 points, and Becky and other people and myself drove it around the state. And then we had UPS to small towns. And so we were actually doing a statewide paper to build a progressive movement. And Becky has never forgiven me because started in 1990, we started the network in 96, and as the network sucked up more of my brain cell, the point ended. And so it's a shame. We will and need to be able to move into more trustworthy reporting, reportage, and investigative journalism. And I can tell you now that it appears that the Southbound Progressive Network is going to get one of this decade's low power radio licenses. So we'll have our own radio station because they do this once every 10 years, and you have to have a 501c3, and it's normally contestable. And normally the Christians get them, but we were the only applicant. And so we have, if we win, which we think we will, we have 3 years to manifest it before we lose the license. So that's something that y'all can look forward to.
By the way, do folks know what David Beasley's up to right now, what he currently does? Let me just share my screen. He is the executive director of the World Food Program. So again, we're talking about these links between South Carolina and international politics. David Beasley is not screwing up his father's business, but is instead in charge of the World Food Program. So
wow,
take that for what you will.
he is actually doing a good job.
Well,
at that.
he
Yeah,
is.
the World Food Program is considered a pretty well-run organization underneath him.
We hope he's got good staff. I think that's probably.
Yeah. Yes. I have no David Beasley fan, but
Any other questions?
Yes.
So has Grow traditionally been affiliated with the Democratic Party? Has Grow been traditionally affiliated with the Democratic Party?
Yeah, that we had, but we have always had a political action committee separate from the Progressive Network. So there's only been like one instant, well, that's not true. We'll get into that next class when we talk about the Progressive Network history. But we do it, we play the inside game, but we don't expect we can win the inside game without a better outside game. And so we are the outside game playing in their inside game. And we'll get into that next week.
All right. Any closing questions or comments?
Well, stay tuned, folks. And if you don't have a copy of the book that deals with this era, Generation No, and that's K, capital N-O-W, Generation No, that Becky's most recent publication. Put your name in the chat. If you don't live in Columbia, we'll mail you one. And Nicole, you're coming here, you'll have to pick it up. And Michelle, I mean.
And keep in mind, we only have 2 classes left, next Monday and the Monday after that. Next Monday, we'll get a bit more into the history of the Progressive Network and really thinking about organizing strategies and effective citizenship. And then on the 17th, we'll be talking a bit more about some of the skills we've talked about in the class, some of the ideas you may have for projects. Again, don't forget that at the end of the class, you should be thinking about what project you want to get involved in, whether it's one that we already have underway, or if you have an idea for a grassroots organizing project of some sort, please start thinking about that right now.
Robert, I've mentioned to some of you, this Saturday is something that the Zen Education Project and Rethinking Schools, which both of those organizations helped us start this school. And they're really trustworthy folks that have been trying to teach truth. And so this Saturday is National Teach Truth Day. And all they ask is for people that are teaching truth to send them a picture or a short video doing something. And we have enough agreement to do it, but we need some more Modjeska School students to turn out at 11 o'clock, be here before 11, come here. And we'll go next door in front of Modjeska's house and we'll alert the media and whatnot. And we'll give a short presentation. Dr. Greene, you gonna be able to? Very, very short, probably 3 minutes long. We'll tape it. And I did a thing that gives the dates and all that one would completely realize that it was a very last minute racist thing that Governor Jimmy Burns did in picking up the phone and calling the governor of Kansas the night before the oral arguments on the Briggs case, convincing the governor of Kansas to file an emergency petition to join that case. And they did it. And so when Thurgood Marshall went in to argue the Briggs case, it was titled Brown. And so the whole world would know about the Briggs case written in Modjeska's house. And now the whole world knows the Brown case, which was about busing. They had buses. The question was, you know, you're driving past the school, you're driving me too far. And in Clarendon County, not only were there buses, the Black people bought buses or a bus, and the county wouldn't give them gas money. And so it was a really egregious case about racist segregation. And Burns argued that we want to make this about states' rights. The states have a right to define the bus routes. And that's what happened. And that's a piece of truth we can do in 3 minutes.
We got Keith, go ahead, your hand's up. This is our last comment for the evening.
A quick remark. I only wish I knew what Brett had gone through with the Progressive Network, because in 2016, unknowing the history with the Democratic Party, we restarted the Progressive Caucus and we ran into exactly all the same brick walls. So anyway, thanks.
You got some young people out there, Keith. You can do it again. Get them to do it.
Some of us have hard enough heads to keep banging them against the brick wall.
Somebody's got to do it.
Well, this class is all about trying to find ways to dismantle those brick walls or necessary running right through them. So on that particular note, have a good rest of your evening. See you again next week. Until then, have a good one.